I'm Robert Zangari. I'm going to be moderating this panel. Two tropes good, two tropes bad. And I'd like for, as we start off, just some ground rules. I'd like to spend just a couple minutes per question. So if you are going to go start rambling on a little longer, I will cut you off and move on to the next panelist. So just try to keep your answers succinct. And then what we're going to start off with. And yes, thank you, David. If anybody here has questions, add them to the chat. I will be looking through the chat as our panelists are answering questions to start pulling those so we can get some for our Q&A section. So if you're listening now, come on. I also will prompt that between some of the questions I have prepared. So the first thing, order of business, is I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And when you introduce yourselves, you just tell us one trope that you think you use uniquely. So we'll go ahead and start with whoever wants to go first.
I can go first. Oh,
okay. All right. I'm Dave Dobson. I write fantasy and also some sci-fi mysteries. The trope I use and have used since my first fantasy book, which was really my first ever book, was police procedural, kind of buddy cop detective stuff. I don't know that I use it uniquely, but I moved it to a fantasy setting, and so my stories in the Inquisitors Guild series center around that kind of thing in a fantasy setting.
okay. My name is Shami Stovall. Shami, like the car class. I guess my favorite trope that I use a lot is the redemption arc, like a bad guy who redeems himself, becomes a good guy. I really, really love that trope in general. I'm always here for it, always clapping. I used to be a criminal attorney, well, more a drug attorney. I worked in the drug courts, and I helped a lot of guys get back to being a normal human being after they were a drug addict for many, many years. So I saw a lot of redemption arcs in real life. So I just really like that feeling of like, oh man, this guy turned it around. You know, they came back from a bad place. So that's my jam.
Great. And I think, Lauren, you're next.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Lauren. I write under the name L.L. Macrae. I'm a fantasy writer, primarily epic fantasy, since 2017. And I think I have 14 books out now. And all of them, without question, have the found family trope. So that's something that I just kind of gravitate to unconsciously at first, but now it's definitely more of something that I consider quite strongly when I write my current work. So found family, misfits, less conventional characters, you know, kind of finding their home. That's something that's really personal to me, and that just finds its way into every book that I write across epic fantasy.
Nice. And then Emily, I think you're the last one.
I'm Emily Fluke. I write urban fantasy, cozy mysteries, and I also have another pen name called Elsa Frey, which is going to be romantic fantasy. So jumping on the romantasy train. I was also going to say found family. That one does show up a lot in my books. I would say I twist it in the fact that they don't start at odds, which a lot of found families can start at odds with each other and then they grow to love each other, whereas mine are more in the cozy realm. So they already really like each other and then they just grow closer.
Very nice. And I'll reintroduce myself again. I'm Robert Zangari. I write classic epic fantasy with my dad, Dan. And one of the tropes we like to use is the chosen one, but flipping it on its head by having the wise old mentor be the chosen one, but he doesn't find out until his mid-50s. So that's part of our story arc for Tales of the Amulet. All right. Need to get my list of questions. But the first question I have for you all are, how do you see tropes? How do you use tropes? And what are your favorite things to do with tropes?
Well, I generally just use tropes as like a guideline. It's especially helpful for readers because sometimes they will see the kind of hallmarks of the stuff that they enjoy, and then they get really invested because, especially with things like found family, where you see like a group or characters, like an ensemble, come together and become like closer, almost closer than friends, like they're all best friends. And when you see those types of signs while you're reading, you're like, wow, I can't wait until they're all, the actual family, where they all trust each other and care about each other. So it's just useful as like a guidepost to signal to readers, the kind of story that you're going to tell. Sometimes it's really great to subvert. I really like the idea of your mentor being the chosen one. That's very funny. I like it when it's a subversion that doesn't completely negate what the trope is about. So a chosen one trope, right? Having the mentor be the chosen one, we haven't negated the chosen one trope. We're still here for a chosen one. It's just you didn't think who it was going to be. A little surprise, right? I would be disappointed as a reader if I was reading a book and there were a lot of hallmarks that we were going to have a found family and everybody was going to be best friends, but then it turned out that they all hated each other and then they killed each other at the end of the book, right? Like I would like actively be like, oh, what was this? So I feel like tropes are really just signs to the readers that this is the kind of story we're going to have. If you are familiar with them, then you're probably going to have a good time. And I guess as long as you don't subvert them completely, people will agree.
Yep.
Yeah. For me, I think tropes, they can be like a really big overarching theme, or they can be shown in much smaller scenes. Ideally both. That's certainly what I do. So I mentioned in my intro that it kind of, for me, found family has always been in my writing, but I wasn't necessarily aware of it, when I started, because back then you kind of don't know what you don't know. Whereas now I'm much more aware of it in like the plotting and the outlining. So I will make sure that I have certain scenes that can share the tropes or the themes in a way that makes sense, either through world building, character development, whatever it might be. So it's always at the forefront of my mind because I want to include tropes that are meaningful to me but also work for the story. So if you're planning out your beats, you can figure out, okay, how can I not just drive the story forward or develop the characters, but how can I show this trope in a really small way, because then it becomes like the core of the story. It's like the heart of it. And with something like found family, that tends to be quite important for me, rather than just, oh, this is just a tick box that I'm going to have these random guys end up together, and it might be really strong, but it's a side piece, and I want it to be kind of at the heart of it. So not every scene, but the major beats, the main characters, they kind of all feed off of that. So I always try to make sure that I've got little scenes to showcase that in a natural way. And then you can say like it has an overarching theme across the book or the series.
I look at tropes as kind of the starch or the meat, I guess, of the meal you're serving up as the book. They're going to be there. You're not going to come up with something new in the human experience because we've been telling stories to each other for 2 million years or something. And they're also, like Shami said, a way to sort of signal, like on a dating profile, if I can mix more metaphors. This is what's going to be in here. I'm on your profile, you might say I'm into dogs and computer games or whatever. And if the person reading your book doesn't see the tropes that you advertise, then they're going to be bummed. But they also might gravitate towards your book because you're signaling them. But yeah, really, they're the heart of books, and they get a sort of a bad rap. But there are only so many stories, and you're going to use parts of the human experience, which are what tropes are, to get your book to be relevant to people. So I think that's what they're for.
What are your thoughts, Emily?
I agree. I was writing tropes into my stories without knowing it originally, I would say. Just the things that I love, and things that I connected to in my home human experience, as like Dave said. Now I use it more as a marketing, so readers know what they're going to get. this is what they're going to connect with in this story. I think it's really important for subgenres to kind of indicate what tropes you are going to get, because there's just so many books out there now and people want very specific things. And that, I feel like, is, I use tropes to connect with my readers, I would say.
Wonderful. I love all of that. So Shami kind of talked about this, touched on this a little bit, but wanted to talk about subverting tropes now and what to do and what not to do when you're subverting a trope.
So I think it's like Shami was saying, and Dave as well, about it's an expectation that you give to a reader. So, for example, dragons are one of my most favorite things in the world. If you know anything about me, read any of my books, you know it's kind of my core obsession. But when you say dragon to someone, they're immediately going to have like an idea of what to expect. And that's kind of what a trope is, be it like a thing like a dragon or a big overarching theme like a chosen one. So you most people, when they think of like a Western dragon, it's going to be like a large fire-breathing lizard. So if you wanted to subvert that, you might keep the fire-breathing lizard aspect, but then give them something else. So in one of my series, for example, the dragons are all spirits. So you've got spirits of a sea, a river, a lake, a forest, and they have associated traits. So you can kind of go crazy with the details as long as you kind of keep that core part of it there. So it's kind of taking something familiar and expected and just tweaking it ever so slightly. So you introduce oh, this is new, or oh, this is different, that kind of way of making a trope feel unique, even though it's still quite familiar. But on the flip side, you can subvert it completely and have something called a dragon that isn't a fire-breathing lizard for whatever reason that is in your world. And that's kind of when you can get really creative, which is why I like epic fantasy, because you can then just build whatever. But you kind of, you start with that core and what that idea is. You don't want to go too far away from it, because like Shami said, if you're expecting to see X and you don't ever get X, you're just going to end up with disappointed readers. So I think bearing in mind that tropes tend to be for managing the reader's expectations and not wanting to disappoint them, which is, you know, where beta readers and feedback can come from, then you're not going to go too far wrong. But I like to start with the core idea that we all know, which is why it's a popular trope, and then like 10-20% twisting it to fit the world. That's kind of my approach to subverting tropes.
So in my
Oh,
most
go ahead.
recent, sorry, in my most recent fantasy book, which is not the police procedural series, I decided to write a book that was based on stuff I read through my whole life, a lot of it in a class I took in college about medieval romantic poetry. So the book is sort of modeled after stories like Tristan and Isolde, or Gawain and the Green Knight, or that kind of thing, where knights go off on quests and have encounters and, you know, develop as they go. And so I subverted it in a really basic way by gender swapping it. So the powerful knight is Lady Isovar, and her squire is this little Weasley guy who is trying to keep her from killing the wrong things, which she just wants to kill everybody. But the major subversion is that she is this completely headstrong person, and I play it all for comedy. And so I think taking that trope from the sort of origins of this big epic tale where everything is important and there's, you know, tons of love and sorrow and all of that, and turning it into something that's pretty silly, still keeps the trappings of the trope, but also makes it, I think, fun. You can't go too far though, because if you drop what makes the trope really good, then you're going to lose that resonance with people who are into it. And so the story actually has a point, and there's some tragic elements and a little bit of a love story, and the adventures end up being important to both of them. But and so there's still that sort of core that's been around for, I don't know, 1,000 years. But I think doing that can help make it sort of relevant and fresh and new, which is what makes tropes better. You know, if they're just going to be the potatoes or the rice in your meal, then you need to add other flavoring to them. Boy, I'm really trying hard with the metaphors. But yeah, I think that's how you make it more fresh. Yeah. So.
Love that. Great.
I think if you use your subversion correctly, it becomes a hook. So like Robert was saying with his mentor is actually the chosen one. That's like it's like a hook that draws somebody in if you already like the chosen one trope. Like you're like, oh my goodness. And I think that's how you do a subversion correctly, is that you should tell somebody who already likes this trope your take on it, your subversion. And if they think to themselves, oh my goodness, I need to go read this immediately, or oh, I've never heard of that, I can't wait to see that, then you know that you've done the subversion where you still are appeasing the correct audience or the people who like this trope, but making it fresh and new, basically. So that's how I know if a subversion has been done correctly, is if it acts more like the hook as opposed to turning somebody off, if that makes any sense. Or like I said, completely shattering the trope. If you say there's a found family, I want a found family by the end of the book. I would be very disappointed if there wasn't a found family, you know. So that kind of thing.
I think for me, the subversion of a trope is super personal, and it's, hey, what have I not seen in stories that I really want to see? And everything under my Emily Fluke pen name is the mom is the chosen one. So I took, Mary Winchester from Supernatural and gave her her own story instead of, what happens to her in the start of Supernatural. So I would say it's maybe close to what you do, Robert, taking somebody who's not expected to be the chosen one and ends up being that. And for me, like I said, it's just very personal. What do I want in a story? I know there's going to be other readers out there that also are like, ooh, I haven't seen that before, but it's also familiar.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things I love about subverting tropes. And like you said, Shami, when you can use it as a hook, it really hooks. I've started using that little phrase about Iltar and how he's the chosen one, and about 90% of the time, the people end up buying the book. And so it's just been a great tool, especially for marketing, to if you use it correctly. So we kind of touched a little bit on my next question. So I'm going to just go ahead and skip past it. And this is a two-parter question. And it's, is there such thing as a bad trope? Or is it perhaps overused?
So what I see a lot of people saying that is a bad trope would be miscommunication in terms of any romantic subplot in your fantasy. And I don't know if I would say that there's a bad trope. I think that there are common tropes that people dislike because what I see is that they're too close to reality. When we're escaping into a book, we don't want to see the characters struggling to communicate. That's something we have every day in our lives. And it's something that can be very easily fixed in a book. So I think if there is a trope where it feels too close to home and you're not twisting it in a fun way at all, I say it, then that's when it becomes a bad trope. It just becomes boring. You're no longer escaping into this new and interesting world. You just feel like, oh, this could be easily solved.
I feel like a bad trope, or there isn't any one trope that I would just label as bad. I feel like any trope can become bad if it is used too lazily, for lack of a better term. If you just literally adhere to it exactly on formula with no passion. I give lots of talks about how if you're going to be an author, you should bring a lot of passion to the table because it translates to the reader. If you're just putting in a trope because somebody said that was the trope of the week, like people were saying that enemies to lovers, was a huge trope. Everybody wanted enemies to lovers. But if you don't have any passion for that and you just put it into a story and it's like the most cookie cutter basic of things, the lady and the man are in a scene and they're like, whoa, we hate each other. And then the guy's like, but you're hot. And she's like, well, you're hot too. And then they kind of give each other, the eyes. You're like, wow, this is happening really fast. And I'm not really into this and it's weird. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a trope that people love, but if you're not handling it right, if you have no passion for the trope whatsoever, it comes across as like stale and not fun at all. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like a trope only becomes bad when the author themselves just, I don't know, use it like an ingredient in it to go with Dave over here with his like metaphors. When you use it as an ingredient in a dish you're cooking and you hate that fucking dish, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's when a trope becomes bad.
Yeah, I was actually going to say enemies to lovers too, and I totally agree with everything you said. One thing I think with that one in particular is that there are tropes that are easier to do, and there are tropes that are more challenging. And enemies to lovers is one that, to me at least, is much more challenging because you have to create reasons why these people don't like each other, and then you have to overcome those to bring them together. And doing that in a way that's sort of realistic and sincere and believable is a hard thing to pull off. You know, it's a lot easier to do some of the simpler tropes. I mean, I don't think found family is always easy, but it has a sort of a growth along the same direction. Whereas enemies to lovers is you have to go a long distance in one direction and then turn it around. So it's a little harder to do. I was going to say I watch a lot of terrible movies. And the scene where I almost always throw the remote at the TV is when there's one powerful magic person with a red ray and one powerful magic person with the blue ray. And the whole climax of the movie is them sort of shooting those rays at each other and not going anywhere and then shouting. And I just think that is so bad, at least movie wise. You don't see it quite as often in books, but yeah, the red ray blue ray thing just puts my teeth on it. So yeah, that's a bad one. No qualification. It's just terrible.
I don't want to say that any trope is bad because I feel like they're all subjective, but I think even popular tropes can be done badly. Kind of like what Emily was saying about the miscommunication. If it's there as like a forced conflict or are used as like a shortcut to something. So a lot of people don't like the amnesia trope because it's often used. It can be used as like a shortcut to info dumpy if you're writing in secondary world. So it's like, oh, I don't really know how to explain to the readers how this economy works. So I'll just give this guy no memory and then he can learn it and then you can learn it through. And that can be really badly done because you're just like then reading page after page of this is how the world works that everybody knows, but there's no reason that the author can think of to give it to you in a natural way. So it's then used as like that shortcut. That's when I think something like amnesia can be used badly. And I say this as someone that actually has an amnesia trope in one of her books, and I get that I lose people at that because you see that and you think immediately, oh, it's not going to be naturally explained to you how the world works or shown through dialogue and action. So I think any trope that's done in a way that's either shortcutty or like a checklist of, oh, the characters must have a conflict here. Oh, we'll just make them mishear the end of a conversation, or stuff like when it's used in that way, whatever the trope might be, that's when it tends to kind of be a bit jarring and like take you out of the immersion of the read. So even if it's the popular trope, if it's done in that kind of way, which is subjective to every reader, then I think it can be bad. But yeah, it varies from person to person. Like what you are annoyed by, I might not be, and vice versa. So
exactly, that's kind of what I was thinking too. Because looking when I was preparing for this and looking back, and I'm like, it's not necessarily that the trope is bad, but the execution, the way it's portrayed, and even certain subgenres don't need certain tropes. I mean, take cozy fantasy, for instance. We're not going to have a big, huge, epic battle at the climax of a cozy fantasy. That just doesn't fit. All right, now on to the next question. Do you guys ever blend and bend tropes? Combining two together and twisting them. Do you ever do that?
I don't think it's something I set out to do intentionally. I almost never have a trope in mind when I'm coming up with a story. I have the story in mind, or because I'm a total pantser, I just have characters and I throw them around and see what happens. But I think you almost can't avoid blending tropes even by accident because tropes are really just pieces of stories. Oh, how about another metaphor? They're little Lego blocks. And you can't build a whole story without assembling a whole bunch of Lego blocks. And so you're going to have them in there, and whether they blend smoothly like the color matches and you've structured them well, or whether they're, clumsy or obviously discordant. That's the big challenge when you're writing, is to kind of pull from them what's good and what fits, and leave out the chunks of them that don't fit. And doing my Inquisitors Guild stories with the police stuff, there's obviously in a fantasy world, you don't have Miranda rights and you don't have our whole legal system, and so blending the sort of fantasy elements with magic and the detective elements is actually where a lot of the fun happens. I gave my Inquisitors Guild a pool where you can set items around the edge, and then the pool will show images of connections between those items. So now the Inquisitors have a tool that wouldn't exist in the real world, but comes directly from the fantasy world, and they can use that sometimes to help solve the mysteries or to be perplexed by what the pool shows and that kind of thing. So I think that's really fun when you're doing something, especially when it's a trope that might be outside your genre and you're bringing it in. That's where a lot of the really neat blending stuff can happen.
So my cozy fantasy, cozy mystery series, I have the tropes of both cozy mystery and cozy fantasy that I bring together, which I think is really fun. So for example, the found family in a cozy fantasy alone might be they're going on a little adventure together and then they grow close. Whereas mine is combined with the cozy mystery of small town. So it's a found family in a small town. They're already in one place. So I think it's really fun, kind of like Dave was saying, to take different subgenres, the tropes of those, and put them together. Another one is an animal companion, which is pretty common in both fantasy and cozy mystery. And then kind of taking those, putting them together, a magical animal companion that might not be the typical cat, make it something different, but still fits into a recognizable town so that cozy mystery readers enjoy it as well.
I think blending tropes is almost sort of par for the course if you're writing like unique stories, because you can take the same 2 tropes or 3 tropes and recombine them in so many different ways and get so many different stories. Like if we were to just say write a story about dragons and found family just with us here, you'd have 5 completely different stories, and then you could like do it again the next day and the next day, and you might have like dragon rider fantasy and the found family are the riders. You could have found family taking on dragons that are attacking the country. You could have dragons that are the found family. There's so many different ways of doing it. And even if you're writing something a bit more formulaic, that's how you kind of readjust the pieces to fit. And you still have what are very recognizably tropes, but in completely different tonal stories, from cozy to dark and romance to humor and everything in between. I tend to go back to a lot of the same tropes in my stories, like thematically speaking, but all of my stories are quite different. So it's that kind of blending and bending of the tropes and the subversions and how much you subvert it versus how much you keep it as expected. That's kind of like where you get all the unique ideas, and then you can just go into the detail that way. I think if you just did the exact same trope the same way and you'd get bored, like just as a writer, because you kind of want to like, okay, let me explore this idea and push it in this direction, or combine it with this other thing. And it's very much like cooking, like if you've got a sauce, all right, let me just add some spice this time, and then you get something completely different. Let me add some smoked paprika, you get something totally different. Like I love that we've got food that we're discussing right now. It's brilliant. So I think the blending of those tropes and just seeing how far you can push them and how much you can tweak them and how to make them work with your story that's one of the fun creative things about being an author. So I would always be looking to start with maybe 2 or 3 tropes in my outlining and planning, and build them out differently every time just to see what you get.
So I wrote an urban fantasy where I decided to use the like Groundhog's Day time mechanic where you kept reliving a day. And I guess I blended a lot of tropes with that. And then like somebody, David Green, I think in the comments section mentioned that cozy fantasy has a lot of like self-discovery or self-acceptance. So I used the Groundhog Day kind of with that trope too, because the main character is suffering from depression, but he uses his Groundhog Day time rewind basically to get better, find his mojo, you know, like that kind of thing, because he has infinite amount of time to collect himself before having to deal with a problem. And I thought that kind of stuff is fun. And I also agree. I think Lauren mentioned this, and maybe Emily, maybe everybody mentioned it. Bringing tropes in from different genres, also super fun. I really loved horror movies and horror video games back in the day. But I don't actually like the structure of horror. I don't like that good guys lose. I don't like that the bad guys are all powerful, but I do like some tropes in there, especially things like body horror when creatures or monsters are transformed physically from some sort of monstrous thing that it's very spoopy to me, like actually. So I used that along with the overpowered hero trope in one of my books. So the overpowered hero, he can totally defeat monsters, but the monsters are very, very monstrous and take a lot of inspiration from horror movies. So yeah, I love blending stuff, love taking tropes from other genres and putting them together with new genres. I think those are great.
That's wonderful. Loving all the metaphors. Two of my favorite things: food and Legos. So this is great. Now we're going to kind of dive into a little bit of subgenre and talk a little more about subgenre. So, are there certain tropes that don't belong in certain subgenres of fantasy that you would just never put in?
I guess the only subgenre where I would think to myself, you might be shooting yourself in the foot if you use specific types of tropes, might be in lit RPG. I don't know if anybody is familiar with this genre, but it is very niche, right? Like it's a category that blends game mechanics with fantasy settings. And I mean, I think Dungeon Crawler Carl has exploded to the point that everybody has read it or at least is aware of it, but he uses his game mechanics. And I feel like in those types of books, people are here for the game mechanics. So if you started to use tropes that negated those types of game mechanics, that you would suddenly be outside of the genre, you know, like you would pull yourself out of it somehow. So that's the only one I can think up off the top of my head. But if there were other genres like that, where if you use a trope, suddenly you've completely shattered the genre, that's how I define it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it depends whether the subgenre has its own expectations or not. I think fantasy and like SFF as a whole is pretty malleable. You can kind of mix and match and genre blend as much as you like. People tend to be okay with it. But like you say, lit RPG has its defined niche. If you try and do too much internal monologuing in there, people are not gonna care. They want action and positivity and focus. Things like romance as well, the happy ever after is a thing that you have to end the book with, or at least happy for now. And if you want to subvert that and be like, oh, that you're going to end on a cliffhanger, you kind of almost lynch yourself because that is not the expectations of that subgenre. You can kind of push the boundaries as much as you like, but that is like a cardinal rule. I feel like I don't really have any experience writing in any of those subgenres where the expectations are kind of set. So I couldn't say anything beyond that. Like I don't write romance either, but I'm just aware that that's one of the subgenres where you have to meet those reader expectations or there's no point in writing it. I hope that there aren't too many subgenres within fantasy that they won't let you get away with doing, pushing the boundaries. I think SFF it likes you to be creative and unique. I think as far as the world building, I think characters may be a little bit more in their fields, and then it's very clear when you're subverting it or not. But as a whole, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say, like what both of them have been saying, that if you're advertising strongly that your book is focused around one trope and you end up doing something that doesn't relate, that's the same thing as putting something bad on your dating profile that you don't actually do. But I would also say that if anytime you make a rule in writing, somebody finds a way to gloriously break that rule and writes a terrific book. So I don't think you should say that something doesn't belong. It's just that that might be hard, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't be a really neat premise if handled well. But yeah, I do think if you're projecting one thing and delivering another, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble as far as finding and keeping readers. So that's something to avoid.
My first thought is just the cozy fantasy again, kind of what was already mentioned. If you're going to have some kind of epic scale save the world or a war or adding in violence, then you're no longer cozy fantasy. So if you're trying to do that, some of those other cozy fantasy tropes, and like Dave says, you're telling the readers that that's what this is, you just want to be very careful not to add in some of those other ones that aren't going to match, and it's no longer is what it's called. It's no longer cozy.
Great. I love all that. I think for me, the only thing would be, and I agree wholeheartedly with Lauren about how malleable the fantasy and the science fiction genre is, except for hard sci-fi readers, because if that you show it, oh, this is a sci-fi story, and if they're expecting anything hard and there's maybe space magic in it, they are like, wow. But yeah, I think most fantasy readers, speculative fiction readers, are pretty forgiving. So, as an author of each of the different subgenres that you guys write in, what tropes do you feel enhance your story and make it the best that it can be?
I think doing a sort of a law enforcement agency in a fantasy world gave me the opportunity to just have a whole bunch of types of scenes that let me develop the story, but that would be familiar to people and sort of comfy if I do them right. So like a bunch of people sitting around in a room talking about their case, or pursuing somebody down a street, or having the chief give orders or be unhappy with what's going on. I think all of those things are very tropey, but they're also familiar and fun and dramatic. And so I think that kind of thing really helped with that book. With the Lady Isovar book, the trope is more sort of, I don't know, fuzzy or subtle, just that there's this knight errant who goes on a quest and meets different people along the way and battles enemies and overcomes both the enemies and her own issues. I think that's less sort of, here I'm obviously using that trope this way, but it actually is the sort of framework on which the whole story hangs. And then the neat stuff that I can do relies on that structure. And so I think that's the way that tropes really can enhance. One is if they give you specific scenes or frameworks or language to use, and the other would be that's your structure, and you're going to add really cool decoration and drama and emotion on top of that. But it can't be the only thing, or it's not much of a story.
So a trope that I've used a lot, and maybe inverted. I saw again David Green asked if we had ever inverted a trope. So this answers both questions. Is I've used the evil Jiminy Cricket trope quite a few times. So Jiminy Cricket trope is where you have like somebody who's giving you advice, but normally can't influence the story themselves, right? Because Jiminy Cricket was a little cricket, and so he couldn't like literally fight off the people that Pinocchio was hanging out with or anything like that. He can only just give you advice. And so I have used somebody there, like a disembodied voice. In one of my books, a character becomes soul merged with like a Death Lord, but the Death Lord lives in the underworld, and main character obviously lives in the realm of the living. So he's constantly hearing advice from an evil Death Lord in what he's doing in the real world. Like he's going to school, like he's at a magical academy type of thing, but then the Death Lord just keeps giving him very over the top, evil types of advice. I find that funny, and that type of book, but I've also written it in a completely different book, but like written it straight, I guess, where somebody is drawing magic from an evil source, like a warlock, but they're trying to be good. But because they draw evil from a magic source, they constantly get this like evil advice or evil, like somebody trying to influence them. And so I really like that trope specifically, this evil Jiminy Cricket. I find it's very fun in a lot of different ways, either comedy or like, oh man, I really hope the hero doesn't ever fall for this guy's shenanigans, you know, like that kind of thing. So really like that one.
So the tropes for cozy fantasy are basically just anything that you can think of that makes you feel good. So that's where I get to have a lot of fun with this subgenre, this genre, is that, you know, food, friends, slow burn, comfortable romance, pets, a cute town, anything you could think of that you're just like, oh, that makes me feel good. So those all enhance the genre that I'm writing in. And it's really fun because as I'm writing it, I get to have those same feel good feelings. And then I get to go tell the readers, this is what you're going to enjoy if you need some kind of little happy escape. Kind of like with romance, where you know you're going to get a happily ever after, or else it better not be called a romance. Same with cozy fantasy. You know that there's going to be most of the story, you're going to feel pretty good. There might be a little bit of danger, a little bit of worrying about those characters, because you do still, of course, want tension, or else it's just too easy and it will get a little boring. But you're never going to be stuck awake at night from the story. You're going to, you know, read it and then be able to go to bed, which is interesting because as an author, you're kind of told the opposite, right? You don't want your readers to ever put your book down. You want to make it so that they can't put it down. But I would say cozy fantasy is a little bit different in that it should just be so welcoming that they don't want to put it down, but they can.
So nice. That's like I'm giving my readers nice dreams instead of nightmares that are going to make them wake up at 2 in the morning in a cold sweat. Um, I like a lot of things, a little bit similar in terms of like, I really love ancient magic and corruption arcs and sort of themes of free will versus destiny, voices in heads and meddling gods, and that kind of thing. But on the other end of the spectrum, I really like found family and dragons and fun world building and bucket loads of magic instead of, you know, this is a world where magic was last seen 1,000 years ago. I want it to be like, you know, a magic soaked world where you've got enchanted forests and floating islands and cities and all that kind of stuff. But I guess along the found family trope, I really like using less conventional characters and sort of quieter characters, you know, kind of neurospicy characters instead of your super confident, snarky protagonists. You know, I prefer like sort of smaller scale, more intimate stories, but within those bigger epics where you have all of that. So it's kind of classic feeling fantasy, but with that almost childlike sense of wonder that you have when you're like, oh, are these rocks in the back of my garden turning into fairies at night? And you know, all of that kind of like hidden wonder, that kind of whimsical vibe in modern epic fantasy. You know, when you really did believe that dragons existed. I don't know what the name is of that, if it has a name or not, but that's definitely my flavor. I think I'm really glad that cozy fantasy is making a resurgence because there's so much like stuff happening in the world and so many like grim dark fantasies right now that's, you know, really focusing on realism and the big scale epic stuff, which is wonderful, but sometimes it's nice to have an epic world with all of that lush, rich adventure quest stuff, but just focusing on normal people, maybe just caught wrong place, wrong time, and then kind of the ripples in the wider world based on what they do. That's kind of where I would position myself. So if you like that feeling of epic fantasy, but without the dark, gritty stuff, and yeah, it's I don't do myself much justice because it's quite difficult to market, but that's kind of where I am.
That's great. Well, I've got my last prepared question. We have at least 2 questions in the chat. So if anybody else has questions, please put them in now. So my last question is, this is aimed mostly towards writers, but if you could give one tip about using tropes, what would that be for new authors?
I would say just don't be afraid of using them. I think a lot of new writers are so worried about not being original that they kind of shy away from, oh, this has been done before. And don't use it as a tool. Use it as it's to there to manage your readers' expectations. If you want to tweak it and subvert it, I think Sanderson has like the 80-20 rule. So 80% familiar, 20% new, and you're not really going to go too far wrong there. So yeah, just don't be afraid to use it. And if you are going to change it, do it more subtly.
I would say my biggest advice would be don't write a book with a vendetta. So if you hate a trope and you are like, man, I'm going to show everybody how awful this trope is and how much this trope sucks, something like that. That's just a bad place to be writing, right? Because people who love the trope don't want to then read a book where you totally trash it because you had some sort of thing to point out. I've seen a lot of people who were like, I'm gonna write romance because all the romance books I've read suck. They don't know about storytelling. I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna totally revolutionize romance. And I'm like, don't do that. Like, if you don't love the romance genre, don't enter the romance genre. Don't hate the romance genre and then come in thinking you're gonna change it all up with your crazy superior writing skills. So yeah, don't write with a vendetta would be my advice.
Yeah, I would say the same thing that I think they're saying, but in maybe a slightly different way, is that you should write what you love because that's the thing that you understand the best. And that'll be a mix of tropes, but those ones that you love are the ones that you're going to be most resonant with, that will be easiest for you to get out on the page. And you do grow as a writer, and taking on something where you're subverting a trope or blending two very disparate ideas or doing crossover stuff, that's something that is great and that you should do in a writing career. But your first book is going to put you through the ringer in terms of just getting it done. And so sticking with something that you love, that you're familiar with, that you know the beats for, is really is going to help you a lot. And then, and which isn't to say write a boring book, but stay where it's comfy, and then you can push yourself later when you know what it's like to have a completed project and a whole story and how long it's going to take you and who your friends are who will read it and who are your friends are who won't read it. And there are a whole bunch of things that you sort of figure out in that first book, and having to worry about doing a trope you don't want or writing to market or any of that is going to slow you down. And my advice would be just stay with what you love, because that's what you'll do best. And that'll be the joy in what you're doing, as opposed to trying to take on something harder. So I don't know, that's what I think.
I don't know if I have anything new to add. I was also going to say, write the tropes that you love. The only thing I would add too is don't be afraid to continually read the books and watch the shows with that trope. I do think that there is this interesting misconception that once you start writing, that you don't want to read in that genre, subgenre, or those tropes, because then you might accidentally copy them, but you won't. You'll have your own special spin on it, most likely. I think it's really rare that you're gonna accidentally copy something. When you're setting out to write your story with your tropes, you're going to put your own spin on it. So continue reading those books with the tropes that you love, and I think it'll only make your book better.
That's all wonderful. Thank you, guys. I love each of those comments. Now, one of the questions we had from Dave that Shami kind of touched on, but want to bring it in for everybody so we can all have it on the recording, is, have you accidentally written a trope and inverted it? And how did you realize it happened?
I don't think I have, or if I have, nobody's told me. But I don't think I have. Sorry, that's a really boring answer.
I guess I've done some stuff where I intentionally did it reverse. I mean, I already talked about my evil Jiminy Cricket, and I think that probably answers the question more thoroughly, but sometimes I have done things like lovers to enemies. And I don't know if that's an inversion or if this is just a different trope. Does that make any sense? 'Cause it's so on the other side of the coin. But yeah, I guess I'm gonna just say evil Jiminy Cricket is my fun inversion.
That's fun.
Yeah, I don't think I've been brave enough to do a full inversion and see how that works, but I did within my Inquisitors Guild series. The first two books they're all different main characters. They're all different detectives in this agency. In the first two books, the main characters were low status and sort of figuring out how to do their jobs. They're right out of the apprenticeship program, and they're fundamentally good people who want to do right by their city and the world, and they're in the job for the right reasons. And the guy I have in the third book in the series, he's a little more of I don't know, an asshole. And his arc, and he still morally wants to do the job right, but he doesn't care about people nearly as much. And so that was a little challenge I made for myself, was to take this guy and see if I could, in a realistic way, make him nicer by the end. And he doesn't do his job the same way the others do, and he doesn't come to the same sort of morality above all end that they do. And so I guess, even though I don't really invert tropes, I sort of inverted my own trope from the first two books to try to do something a little different with him. And then he's paired in the book with another POV who is one of those sort of actually, she's still in the Inquisitor school and still learning, and she's gotten herself in trouble, and so she ends up finding something out that helps her redeem herself. So it's still very tropey, but I did try to twist it a little bit to do something new.
I would say this is probably not an inversion, but the only accidental trope I have done is, again, it's more blending genres, but in my Mari Fable mystery series, she's an investigative journalist hunting fairy tale crimes in San Francisco for fairy tales that have come alive. Well, in most investigative journalists or sleuth stories, the character doesn't actually go through an arc. They're pretty stagnant. They stay the same, and it's the story that changes around them. Which is not the way it is in fantasy, of course. And since I combined this with urban fantasy, I did take a character that is supposed to be more stagnant, and I had her change very minusculely on her arc. So it's kind of a blend of both of them, where she's not going in that series, she's not undergoing a major change. There's no self-acceptance or self-discovery. That's, I would say, on a big fantasy scale, since I took more of the investigative journalist side of, she's pretty stagnant. She stays the same. The world changes around her. So it's a mix of both. And that one was done accidentally and told to me kind of by readers of, I think they enjoyed it because they came to me saying they really liked it. So.
For my dad and I, we actually, our whole thing with Iltar about the chosen one is the wise old mentor, we actually didn't really plan that in the original iterations of Tales of the Amulet. And in fact, what we were trying to do with Iltar was kind of a reversal of the hero cycle and do a villain cycle. Because initially, when my dad first started these, he was trying to he had Iltar as the villain, but when he ended up going back and adding to the story beforehand, we was so focused around him that when we started writing it together, some of our early readers were like, Iltar's supposed to be this bad guy, but he seems to have a little bit of a good streak in him. And so when we decided to redo Tales of the Amulet this last time, it was okay, let's actually lean into that and see what we can do with that. So that was a total accidental thing, and it's been one of the best things we could have done for the series. We had another question, and it was, I forgot who asked it. I think it might have been Jessica. But when you start a new story, do you ever go in and with intentional choosing of tropes, or do you just let them flow naturally.
I do
do
now.
now.
Sorry.
Oh, we both said the same thing. I do now. Go ahead.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, I think when you have done it a few times, like Dave was saying, you've been through the process and you know kind of like how long it takes and what to expect and things like that, and you're kind of done muddling your way through, and now you're like, right, okay, this is my next series, this is what I want it to be about in terms of these character stories. I definitely pick like 2 or 3 tropes that I can use. Like everyone has been saying, marketing hooks really is good to kind of like build it from the ground up. So it's not just writing a story and then thinking, okay, what do I do with it? You kind of have to think of like the sales aspect of it afterwards. So you have to think of what happens afterwards, aka the sales aspect. So I have to think of that when I'm plotting. So yeah, I definitely pick like 2, 3 overarching ones. And if others crop up, you know, just because that's how the story goes, then fine. But I definitely write tropes with intent now. But I'd never used to, so it's still new for me.
I guess I intentionally use some tropes. I don't use it to completely write my whole outline, but sometimes I will pick a way a certain subplot is going to go based off of like a trope that I like. You know, I mentioned that I like redemption arcs, so sometimes when I'm like, okay, this villain is doing XYZ, but can he have a redemption arc later? You know, like that kind of thing I will think about and try to incorporate in my outline or my writing.
I think I frequently have a tropey setup, you know, with the sort of mystery story in a fantasy setting, or a you know, the knight errant tale. And then I've done that in my sci-fi too. One book's an alien invasion, the other one is a mysterious remote world, you know, kind of thing. So I always have, and I in my modern day mysteries too, I have a little bit of a standard setup, but because I don't plot them out ahead of time and I don't have pages of lore or anything, then I think they kind of develop and pick up tropes or subverted tropes or whatever as I go. So yeah, I think I certainly don't plan to have all of them, because I often start a chapter without knowing how it's going to end. But I do have a setup, or a kind of a, you know, it's like when, if we're doing food still, you decide we're having chicken for dinner. Okay, well, what kind of chicken? Or we're having pasta for dinner. You know, well, what kind of pasta? And I think that's how I start. Is this is going to be the main sort of substance, but then I kind of find out where it's going to go as I move.
So like I was saying, I do now for sure. I look at the tropes beforehand. I would say I use them as part of the outline because I do want to think ahead at marketing and how it's going to connect with the readers and what are their favorite parts going to be. And I think that, you know, tropes done well, like we said, they follow, you don't want to subvert them too much. So I think putting them into my outline for me personally helps me make sure that I'm not going off of the trope too much and that it's there in a way that the reader is still going to be able to recognize and enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So as we get closing out for this panel, I'd just like each of you to say where readers can find you, and what is your next upcoming project, and how we can, you know, get a hold of that or help you out with it.
So readers can find me anywhere books are sold. I have my books all over the place. Shami is a pretty unique name. I haven't met anybody else with the name Shami. Don't just Google Shami without Stovall though, because apparently a lot of people in the Middle East have the name Shami, and you'll get somebody who's not me, but that's okay. My upcoming project is the urban fantasy. So the guy who can rewind time. So he basically has Groundhog Day style powers. He uses it to solve crimes and catch criminals and murderers and stuff like that. It's not really a police procedural in that sense because it's he's a warlock. We're in an urban fantasy setting and he's catching mostly like magical creatures like monsters and other stuff like that. So But it is in that similar, like, we're solving a mystery, only the main character is overpowered because he has as much time as he wants to gather all the evidence. So I have the third book of that coming out in March.
Awesome.
I'm about 94,000 words into my third modern day mystery. I write in a lot of genres, which they tell you not to do. And I'm having all of the success that they tell you you won't have. But but yeah, that should be coming out in March. I've had fun. That's so different from fantasy because you start with a world where, and I'm sure you people who write urban fantasy have already experienced this. You're writing in a world that already has rules that people understand, and you don't have to make up all the stuff, but you're also gonna mess up. Like if I don't get the way an attorney general works in the real world, there are a whole bunch of people who are going to tell me that I got that wrong. And in the fantasy world, it's like it's just whatever you said, you know. So, but anyway, so I've got that coming up probably end of March, and then I'm going to dive back into something. I don't know. I have about 2 or 3 books that are about a third done. I don't know which one I'm going to pick up again. My website's davedobsonbooks.com, and all of my stuff is on Amazon, and all but one are in Kindle Unlimited. So that's the best way to look for me. So yeah, love to hear from anybody who has comments or questions too.
You can find my books on emilyfluke.com, but I'll be honest, I'm not super active on my website. I am very active on Instagram and Book Talk and stuff. So you can find those through my website. You should be able to find my books at Barnes & Noble and Amazon, Audible. As for my next project, under the Emily Fluke pen name, I do have the 4th book of my 1990s cozy fantasy series coming out in March. So that's Banshees, Boomboxes, and Bones. That will be a lot of fun. So that is very like party, think of 90s party movies, but set with a cozy fantasy in a witch college. So that was really fun to write. And then on my other pen name, Elsa Frey, I am writing a romantasy that is Viking vampires. So that's been really fun and really different. So a bit like Dave, where I write very different things.
So my current project is The Broken Sword, which is the 3rd and final book in my Dragon Spirits trilogy. Hoping to get that out this summer. I'm only about 15,000 words into it, so it's still early. So we'll see if I hit that summer release or not. You can find me at my website, llmacrae.com. All the socials, while they're still up, are linked there. You can also join my newsletter, which I send out once a month. I've got a Patreon as well, where I have an exclusive fantasy serial, and I write behind the scenes essays as well. So craft of writing, being an indie author, weird stuff that I do, and successes and failures. You can get all my books on my website as well. So I self-distribute my physical books, so you can get them signed on my website. I ship internationally, as well as the ebooks and the audiobooks too, plus swag. So I've got bookmarks, I've got artwork, pocket dragon pins, all the fun stuff. So basically that's a good hub for everything. And then you can find me elsewhere if you prefer to buy on the Zon or from other retailers. But LL Macrae is the website.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And again, I'm Robert Zangari. You can find me at legendsofkalda.com, Kalda. And you can find me all over social media. I'm just Robert Zangari. My next project is actually a little different from mine and my dad's classic epic fantasy. I'm venturing into some children's fantasy thriller horror stories, kind of along the lines of Goosebumps, but as if our fantasy world were bleeding into the real world. So you can find some more information on that there. And you can find my books wherever books are sold. I'm wide, both audiobooks, ebooks, and physical books. So once again, thank you, panelists. This was great.
Yeah,
real
thank you,
pleasure.
everybody.
Great-
It was a great
Great
panel.
to meet you all.